All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. Michigan Virtual's efforts include providing online courses to K-12 students across Michigan and the United States, as well as providing a variety of professional learning opportunities for educators focused on innovative educational practices such as blended learning, providing resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Today, we are incredibly excited to have with us Kevin Heller from UC Scout to talk to us about a recent study that he engaged in looking at the University of California's novel use of the 52 iNACOL standards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to introduce himself and get us started.
All right, thanks very much, and thanks to MVLRI for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm not going to read this to you, but one of my primary roles as Associate Dean at Scout from University of California is to oversee the curriculum development and the implementation and the outreach for our online high school classes. And my style of presentation is rooted, I think, very heavily in my background. I spent about 10 years in the classroom before making the switch to administration. And so I like it when participants ask questions. And whether you want to do that verbally, if you have the power on this webinar, or in the chat box, please feel free. I don't mind any kind of interruptions. I welcome that kind of engagement. So thank you very much. This is one of the things I changed. But before we get too far into it, I wanted people and participants to think about these two questions. We don't really have to pair up right now, but spend 10, 20 seconds thinking about, are there different kinds of standards, and can you prioritize standards at all, or is that not possible to do? And if you want to, throw out any different ideas for different kinds of standards in the chat box. That'd be great also. Meaning standards from different organizations. I think even more generally than that. Standards for online education, sure, but also standards for program standards, sure. Even something like, tech standards, even, weighing stuff, measurement standards. And then within that, exactly. Program versus course. Maybe I shouldn't have to read these out loud because it's being recorded. Yep, okay, you guys got it. And within those, there's all kinds of actual standards, and then the question becomes, are some more important than others? And so Larry Ainsworth wrote a book in 2003 called Power Standards. And this was the idea that with the exploding number of standards that students have to learn in a school in a particular year, teachers were faced with a very difficult choice. Do you cover all the standards or just some of the standards? And to what depth do you go into? And the example he gives is what he calls punting the rhombus. And so he was talking to some elementary school teachers, and they were talking about how by the end of the year, they don't have time to go into how you calculate the area of the rhombus. And he put it to them, what's more important? Calculating the area of squares and triangles, or making sure students know how to calculate the area of a rhombus. And so those fundamental standards, square and triangle, are really the basis of expanding into a rhombus and something like that. And so the idea from that school became we should punt the rhombus and just focus on the standards that we think are most important. In 2013, he wrote a revised version, but he changed the name from power standards to priority standards because that seemed like a better fit. But it's funny that that name stuck because later on we'll talk about how the University of California deemed some of the iNACOL standards to be power standards. But it is really, when we're talking about Ainsworth, the idea that some standards are more important than others. And so content standards versus opportunity to learn standards. So when Ainsworth wrote both of his books, he was talking about content standards. Something like by the time a child finishes 5th grade, they will have mastered, calculating the area of a square, for example. Opportunity to learn standards are different. It's more of the conditions required for students to be able to learn. So it doesn't really matter what the subject is. It's, students should have a safe place to learn. Students should have enough food so they can focus on learning and things like that. And so the iNACOL standards that I'm assuming most people who are listening to this or watching this are familiar with the iNACOL standards. Those are really more like opportunity to learn standards. They're not content standards specifically. And so the question becomes, it seems fairly clear from Ainsworth that you can prioritize content standards, but it's kind of an open question, for me at least. Can you prioritize opportunity to learn standards? Is having a safe place to learn more or less important than having adequate materials with which to learn? I'm not sure how you pick one over the other as being more important. So what, actually? Here in California, we have the Boers Committee, which is a pretty funny name for the UC committee that is charged with setting the standards for eligibility. So if you're a high school student in California, you need to take a certain minimum number of courses that have been previously approved under the regulations of Boers. And UC handles that for the California State University system as well. So all in all, a little over 30 universities use this A through G system. And it's A through G, like history, social science is A, B is English. There's math standards, and then languages other than English, visual performing art, electives, science, things like that. So the different categories are A through G. And so one of the things Boers is charged with is evaluating the courses. And so you don't want to get to the point in high school where you apply to a university or UC or CSU and then have them say, I'm sorry, but this English course you took was not A through G approved, so it doesn't count towards meeting the eligibility requirements. So to that end, every high school in California maintains an A through G list with UC and online course providers as well. So Scout, for example, is not a school, but we do have an A through G list, and it's open to the public. Anyone can go and check to verify that a course has been approved for A through G credit in advance. And so a few years ago, faced with the explosion in the growth and popularity of online education, the Boers Committee needed a way by which they could evaluate online courses. And so they used the iNACOL standards as part of their evaluation process. And the formula that they came up with requires a course to meet 15 power standards. And so the power standards are, of the 52 iNACOL standards, the Boers Committee selected 15 of those standards to be what they call power standards. And so you have to meet the 15 power standards and 27 of the remaining non-power standards in order to make it to the next round. And so for 1 year, there was an external organization called CLRN, C-L-R-N, that handled that first round of evaluation, but their funding went away. And so now UC handles that initial evaluation too. And so the question that sparked this research is, well, is it even fair to say that these 15 power standards, are they really the most important standards? Is it even possible to prioritize the standards? So that's how I ended up going down this path. I mentioned that already. And we have 1.7 million high school students in California. that are affected by these policies. And it's important also to know the board's committee has a representative, a voting representative from every UC campus. And so these professors are drawn from all different disciplines. And so it's possible that that the board's committee is put into the position of being asked to create policies around subjects where they may not be experts in. And so they sometimes bring in consultants to consult with. But the current formula came from a subcommittee of the board's committee. So a group of 3 professors came up with this formula, and they don't have a background in online education. And so that sparked the idea maybe we should reevaluate. And again, feel free to throw in questions if you have any. There were 3 official research questions. I'm not going to read them to you, but the first research question really is the primary research question, and that's what most of this presentation will focus on today. We'll touch on 2 and 3 a little bit, but it's really number 1. That's the big one. And so, all right, methodology. The original proposal that I put in wanted to do, a respondent would be presented with 2 options, just 2 of the standards, and they'd be asked to pick which one is more important. And that was rejected as being too simplistic. And so the modified proposal involved taking one of the 5 domains from the iNACOL standards and presenting all of them. And so, for example, if there were 10 standards in that first domain, asking respondents to pick the top 2 most important standards out of that pool, out of that domain. But that too was too simple. And so what the committee ended up asking me to do was, you'd still be presented with those standards from one domain, but you'd be asked to pick the top 2 most important, and then the 3rd and 4th most important, and then the 2 least important. And so throughout all this, there's also the question of, if this was too complex of a task to ask respondents to do, is that skewing some of the results? So that's an open question, and it's debatable, but again, feel free to jump in if you have questions on the methodology. Overall, and so what we ended up with was a percentage of, so let me walk through this slide. That's what I'll do. So here where it says power mean, that's the average. So we could say approximately 31% of respondents would select a power standard as being among the top 2 most important standards. And those among the non-power standards over here, only about 18% would pick those as being among the top 2 most important. And so when you look at the difference there, the difference was highly significant. And then when you look at the bottom 2, you see a higher percentage over here under non-power standard. And that's hopefully what you'd want to see. You wouldn't want them to be identifying power standards as being among the least important. And that too was significant. And there was some question of how best to describe this. So 176 respondents provided a total of approximately 1,800 responses to questions. So how you want to consider that is up to you. It's open to interpretation. Before we get into it further, there's this great paradox, which I love, called Simpson's paradox. And it's a simple example from Wikipedia, but essentially, if you look at the stats from David Justice in 95 and 96, he had a higher batting average than Derek Jeter both years. But when you combine them, Derek Jeter had the higher batting average. And so that idea, if you combine categories or separate categories, might be at play when you consider that so these are overall results for top 2. And iNACOL standards, there's 5 different domains to consider. And the 5 iNACOL domains, there they are. And by the way, I'll mention an article at the end, the Adelstein and Barber article that is in the Journal of Online Learning Research. Is kind of the first attempt to validate the iNACOL standards. So a lot of what I'm doing here is inspired by that article. It's a great article. So when we consider the content domain, the first domain, approximately 22% selected power standards versus 14%, and that was not a significant difference there. As I was going through this, one of the professors on my panel pointed out that I need to actually run clustered standard error, or account for clustered standard error, because originally if there were 10 choices and you pick one, you're not really picking another 1 out of 10, you're picking 1 out of 9. And so throughout these slides, you'll see the original p-value and then the same p-value but run slightly differently in Stata to accommodate clustered standard error. Most of the time it doesn't make a difference, but sometimes it does make a difference. And if I'm going too fast, again, jump in on the chat box. So what we're looking at now are the content standards, and hopefully it's large enough that you can see them. The ones that I've highlighted in green are the ones that the Boers Committee has identified as being power standards. And so those are the ones you have to meet. However, these are ranked in order of preference from the respondents. All the respondents were teachers who have experience with online education. And so we have a great match with the first standard. Both boards and the teachers seem to agree, but then there's a whole gap between until we get down to the power standards in terms of what the teachers think are most important. I also just want to make sure I'm not going too fast, make sure people get what I'm talking about here. So again, throw out a chat if you have any questions. When we turn to instructional design, this was not a significant difference that was found. And when you accommodate cluster standard error, no significant difference there either. And when we get down to the actual standards, again, the ones in green are the ones Boers has identified as being power standards, and they're the ones required in that formula. But there's some overlap, but not a huge amount of overlap with what actual online teachers think are the most important standards. When it comes to student assessment, we do have significant findings here, and the teachers were more likely to pick power standards as being among the top 2 most important standards. Interestingly, when you look at this, there's only 7, so I think it's the smallest of the domains, but there is generally strong alignment between the opinion of Boers and the opinion of the respondents, but also note here these 2 are tied in terms of what the teachers selected. When it comes to the technology domain, we are highly significant results there, and generally strong alignment. There's some areas we could debate about, but generally strong. When it comes to course evaluation, these are not significant findings. And if we look at the actual standards, yeah, we have one that's ranked number 2 by the teachers, but the next power standard is number 5 according to the teachers and what they feel. So those are the 5 domains that I looked at. I also mentioned one of the research questions had to do with whether years of experience in online or traditional mediums played a difference in teacher opinion. Sometimes all the demographic data, sometimes those results were significant, sometimes they weren't. I wasn't able to find any patterns in the data, but I can provide the de-identified data if anyone else wants to dig into it and see what they can find. The qualitative results were pretty interesting, and so these were based on both interviews with respondents as well as the free response sections in the survey. Interestingly, most of these people were not even familiar with the iNACOL standards, even though they worked in online education as online teachers. For the most part, one of the trends that emerged was teachers seemed to use the iNACOL standards, the ones that were familiar with the iNACOL standards seemed to use them as kind of a checklist of things that they already do. They already know that they're supposed to do this, and they just use it as as a reminder, kind of. There was what I'm calling positive ambivalence towards the idea among most of the respondents of the idea of the iNACOL standards and whether or not you can prioritize them. It was kind of an attitude of like, well, probably it's fine to prioritize them, but most respondents didn't feel particularly strong about that idea. But there was a small minority of respondents who noted that they called prioritization a false choice, and they did, voice the opinion that you can't really prioritize these opportunity to learn standards. One of the other things that was interesting was there was a general call for more professional development around online teaching amongst the teachers, and that kind of makes sense. They were teachers, and they'd like to have more professional development. I think that's a good thing. But in terms of implications for policy and practice, I think we're not clear if you can prioritize opportunity to learn standards, and you see that Bohr's committee may want to reevaluate its formula. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I should have mentioned, as part of this research, I found out that the Bohr's committee has a slot open for a graduate student representative. And so I've just started my third year on the Bohr's committee, and it's been an interesting experience seeing how universities make policies and how they evolve and how they modify those policies. So I'm working on it, but it's a slow process. We definitely need more research on the topic. And yeah, yes, you're right, Catherine. It would be a great study. And so one of the overall recommendations is, it seems clear to me that you shouldn't make a policy without first consulting with people that are experts in that particular field. In a lot of ways, they're a lot like, the Bohr's committee is a lot like, a legislator, where they're called upon to make policy and make decisions about everything under the sun. And so they do bring in consultants from time to time, and that's an important part of what they do. I have a list, I'm not going to read it to you, of ideas for future research. I'm also open to other ideas if anyone has any ideas. Catherine, I appreciate your recommendation on how policies are formulated in organizations. And so I'm open to collaborate. I'm open to talk more about ideas. If anyone wants to de-identify data, that's available too. You know what? I will read this one to you. One of the big areas of weakness for this study was I didn't talk to any students. And that's something that I think a lot of us overlook sometimes when we're doing research into online education. We don't talk to the actual students. And so I'd like to include students in future research projects. And I also, you know what? Also, I do wonder if the overly complex survey design did something to the results. I'm not sure it's fair to ask someone to say, review these, 12 sentences and prioritize them. Yeah, I agree, Catherine. We need more student voice. But, when I think about the complex survey design, I think if somebody gave me, a list of, 12 important vitamins, I'm not sure I'd be able to pick out the two most important vitamins because they all seem pretty important to me. Anyway, we can talk about other design issues in the chat box or offline if people are interested. Oh, and I did want to send out special thanks. Catherine, Justin, Jared, and all of MVLRI has been very supportive. Catherine, I appreciate you reading early drafts of my dissertation. That was a big help. And some of the next people listed are people I work with, and they've been very helpful. And then one plug, if you haven't yet read the Adelstein and Barber article, it's a great article, and I think it's pretty rich, and it really, I think, can serve as a jumping off point for a lot of different projects. And both David Adelstein and Michael Barber were very helpful in talking me through some of the questions I had. So very accessible people, great people. Catherine connected me to them again. Appreciate that. And then there's my email address. And so if we have any questions or comments, this is a great time for them. And I will answer any questions or comments or address them. And if not, then I'll turn it back over to Justin. Catherine, yes. In fact, I have submitted, Joler is my journal of choice for this. So I have submitted it to Joler, and I don't know if you say Joler, but you know which journal I mean, the Journal of Online Learning Research, the same journal that you're involved with, and that the Barber and Adelstein article was published in. So now I just wait for the editorial committee to get back to me with a thumbs up or thumbs down. Thanks. So, what am I most interested in continuing in my line of research? Well, student voice is one area. The next would be, I think there's probably something to be said for connecting with Quality Matters and looking at some of the overlap between the iNACOL standards and Quality Matters. And I'd be really interested in particular to know, for example, if I were to replicate this study, would I get similar results with the Quality Matters standards? Something else, another direction to look at this question from is not necessarily teacher voice or student voice, but having trained evaluators go into a course itself and, in a sense, score the course the way Quality Matters assigns scores for particular subjects or particular standards to see if there's any overlap with Quality Matters and iNACOL as well. Yeah, so that's that. Oh, and also I should mention, I called it out in my dissertation, but I'll say it out here as well. MVLRI, I was struggling to find respondents, and so MVLRI put out the call to the link for my survey on the blog and with their connections, and I got way more respondents than I had hoped for as a result of that, so I really appreciate that as well. Yeah. The crosswalk document, yes. I need to review that more, actually. Oh, and just it looks like somebody's still typing. I'll throw it out there also. Not just looking at evaluating courses and scoring them to see to what degree they meet those standards, but also incorporating student learning outcomes into that as well. Oh, okay, good lit review. Excellent. Sounds good. Interesting. Okay, I'll take a look. Thank you. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, Justin, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing the results of that study, and we are definitely going to look forward to some increased attention on that work, as well as some findings that come out from further research. I'm just going to pull up the document one last time here. We have just a couple more slides before we wrap up. I want to make mention of a few more MVLRI initiatives for folks who might not be familiar. We do have a podcast series as well as a blog series, so we encourage you to go check out both of those outreach efforts. We did just release a podcast this week from a researcher from UC Irvine, as well as from a researcher from MIT, folks who are affiliated with the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub. Excuse me, looking at inequities in learning technologies in the K-12 setting. So we encourage you to go check out that latest episode there, as well as our blog series where you can find the latest from researchers all around the country who are sharing their work either finalized or in progress. So take a look there. And if you're interested in becoming an author for the blog series or being a guest on the podcast, please reach out to us and let us know. We'll include our contact information here in just a couple slides. We also have another webinar coming up just before the holidays, December 20th 2 p.m. Eastern, same time, and potentially same location. We may be in a different location, but if that's the case, we will definitely let our audience know that we'll be working in a different platform. But for now, we are scheduled to participate right here in our Adobe Connect room, and we'll be hearing from our own Rebecca Simpson as well as Rebecca Parks, an MVLRI fellow from Mansfield University, on their teacher guide to K-12 online learning. So that will be a very helpful and practical session, I believe, highlighting that resource that was published recently. And lastly, just a few contact points of interest here. If you're interested in providing us feedback on any of our efforts, you can email us at mvlri@michiganvirtual.org. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking that link that's in that second line there. And you can also follow us on social media. Our Facebook and Twitter handles are listed, as well as our YouTube channel, where you can view all of the recordings of our previous webinars, and you'll be able to see the recording of this webinar in about 24 to 36 hours. And then also, if you check out our website on our presentations and webinars page, you can see all of the archived webinars that we have there as well. Kevin, we want to once again thank you so much for hosting, and thank everyone else for joining us today. We hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.